Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Done Dissertation Office Hours, where we talk with doctoral students and doctoral degree recipients about how they plan to or how they have leveraged their doctorate for impact in their field. I'm your host, Dr. Ramon Goings, founder of Done Dissertation, where we demystify the dissertation process so that you, the doctoral student, can write and defend your dissertation in 1 year or less. To learn more about our services, visit www.thedonedissertation.com to save thousands of dollars in tuition by finishing your dissertation in months instead of years. I'm honored today that we have a very special guest. I wanted, as always, to bring you all different types of guests who do and leverage their doctorate in different spaces. And so today's guest, we have Dr. Jill Perry, who currently serves as an associate professor of practice at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education and is an executive director of the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate, also referred to as CPED. I want you all to get this insight about how you can leverage your doctorate to be in academia, but also be in other spaces where you can make an impact on the field broadly. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Perry.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you, Ramon. Thank you, everybody, for having me.
Thank you so much. As always, I think a lot of times when folks see everybody with their doctorate, particularly for students, right, they're wondering, well, how does that person get there? And so I'm always interested, and I always like to first start our conversation with talking about your backstory a little bit, so people know, how'd you become Dr. Perry? And so, was this something when you were younger that you always said, I'm going to get my doctorate one day? Was this in the books for you from maybe say younger, maybe K through 12 age, or even undergrad?
I hadn't actually thought about it, but I think the seed was planted when I applied for undergrad. My dad, who was very old school, grew up during the Depression, said to me as we were filling out the college application together, "Are you going to be a doctor, a businessman, or a lawyer?" And I thought, none, Dad. I went to school to study Spanish, and he couldn't get his head around that. And he said, "Oh, you'll be a translator. There you go." He had to know what the job was going to be, right?
Good.
And so I got my degree in Spanish and international relations. I went off and worked in international education for a very long time. Also picked up my master's during that time in higher ed administration with a focus on international. And then at some point decided in my 30s that I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do, if I wanted to stay in higher ed or if I wanted to get into development work, all international related kind of work. And so I was about to go get a doctorate when I thought about how I'd always wanted to join the Peace Corps. So I happened to be a point in my life in 32 where I had no real responsibilities personally. And so I quit my job and I joined the Peace Corps, and I went down to South America for 2 years. I was in Paraguay and worked in everything from education to the municipality to working with little kids. I did everything. And while I was there, I applied for my doctorate at the University of Maryland because I wasn't really sure coming home if I could just jump right back into a university job. And I knew, having been down there, that I wanted to do something mostly in international development. And so I applied for a degree in international education policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. And through that process, I got hooked up with a man who ultimately became my advisor, Dr. David Immig, who was working with the Carnegie Foundation at the time. And they were looking to try and distinguish the difference between the EdD and the PhD, which had been at that point, probably an 80-year debate on what the distinction was. And so I became the grad assistant on that project. And as I kept going through it, I was finding my time divided between trying to work on a dissertation that was internationally related, and my department was having some staffing changes, so there wasn't a lot of support for students at the time. And then working with this consortium of faculty around the country who were trying to make this distinction. And so I kind of got in a little too deep there and switched my dissertation focus. I was originally working on something with teacher educators in Latin America, and then switched my dissertation focus to understand how schools of education, because I'd had a higher ed background, I wanted to understand how they were making changes to their doctorate. And often if you go into the field as a professor or in academia, your dissertation kind of defines who you are. So while I had that strong international background, I kind of went with where my dissertation took me, and started out with a postdoc at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and then ultimately came over to the University of Pittsburgh. And all that time, the Carnegie Project kept growing and growing and became a 50C3 under my leadership. and I became the executive director, and that's where we are now. So I do a little bit of both. I'm 50% faculty, 50% executive director, which really means 100% on everything. And
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know. Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah,
So
there's definitely some things we could talk about based on what you described. So the first thing I want to go to is to rewind back when you're in your doctoral program and you decide to switch your dissertation topic.
yeah.
What did that look like? And like now looking back on it, what advice would you have for students who are contemplating doing that similar thing?
I think you kind of have to go. This is a tough one because, I was originally working on international work, and some days I go, why didn't I keep doing that? Because I would so love to be in international work. But I think you got to go where your heart is in the moment and what you really want to work on. And when I went to go, I have a PhD. And when I was thinking about going to school, someone said to me, you don't go for a doctorate unless you have questions. And I applied before I had questions, but I had questions once I'd gone through the Peace Corps and then come back to school. And of course, your mind changes, but the doctorate's a lot of work for just going to get a credential, right? You got to go because there's something you want to learn. And so when I was switching my topics, it made sense to me, not only because I didn't have the faculty support that I needed because we were down faculty in our department, and that's, common in what happens
Yeah.
in grad schools. I'd also been developing, I could have stuck with that completely, but I'd been developing this interest in distinguishing the EdD from the PhD. And I had been working with big names at the Carnegie Foundation, with faculty all over the country. And what I was starting to see was that there was this disconnect between understanding not only the doctorates, but faculty were struggling with these ideas of what it means to design a program at a doctoral level. And so I have always worked in some form of programming, whether it was international education or in K-12 schools. And so for me, the idea of working with people struggling to build programs that would better support practitioners really was something that I kind of got sucked into. And so I did it, and I knew, I had a strong enough international background that if I decided I wanted to go back to that, I could. I also knew that there was an opportunity to bring international work into this idea around the EdD program. So I wasn't so worried about that. But I saw a real opportunity to change how we think about education at the doctoral level in our country. So I went with my heart, and I think you have to do that. If I've had students who are like, well, if I just do it this way, I'll get it done. And I'm like, yeah, and it's going to hurt. And it's going to take you longer because you don't really want to do it. If you go with something that you were passionate about, that passion revives you every time you sort of hit a slump.
No, that's great. And I think, I think a lot of students are always contemplating that. I know a lot of our clients do that. They're just wondering, well, do I stay with this topic? Do I move? And then they're always wondering if I do change to what I really want to do, and I don't, they're always concerned about the support and all those types of things. So when you made this move, did you find, like, I know you mentioned that there was a change in faculty. Did you find that you just had a more supportive environment to make the change? And like, had you not had that, would you maybe have thought differently?
Yeah, I think, because there were faculty all over the country really that supported me. The faculty in my institution were struggling with how to manage all the students who were without an advisor because we had lost some faculty. So I just sort of found myself in a place where I was being mentored by people that I just, you might not even think to call up, right? But these faculty were sitting me down and saying, what do you want to do? How can I support you? And I thought, well, you don't pass up that opportunity, right? So I really felt supported. Within my institution, I also felt supported. They recognized that the topic wasn't an international topic, but they said, we'll roll with it because we need to support you since we'd lost your advisor. So everyone around me was completely supportive of what I'd done.
That's great. And another thing I want to come back to that you mentioned that was kind of the impetus for your dissertation somewhat is just like this idea of this PhD versus EdD debate. And I'm curious of what your thoughts are on it. It seems it still goes on. So I'm just curious as to why we still continue to see it. Because if you go on any doctoral support group on like Facebook or Twitter, there's always, it seems like every maybe once a quarter, there's these just fire exchanges between folks online. So could you talk a bit about this debate and why you think it still is persisting?
Well, I think so. I wrote a whole chapter in my dissertation about the history of the EdD, and it really wasn't until I dug into that history that I got to understand what the problem is and why we can't seem to distinguish the EdD from the PhD. Originally, the EdD was created at Harvard College by oh my gosh, I can't believe I just forgot his name. Henry Holmes, who did not have a doctorate, but had got a bunch of money from the Carnegie Foundation to create the School of Education. And he wanted to find a way to create, at that time, it was early 1900s. And at that time in Boston, the school systems were growing from all the immigrants that were coming in, and there was only a position known as principal. And he saw a need for some sort of administrative role that would oversee big groups of schools, what we would know as a superintendent today. And so he wanted to create a practitioner degree. He also wanted autonomy from the School of Arts and Sciences. Traditionally, the School of Arts and Sciences are the ones that offer PhDs. And so if you had a PhD in education, you still had to have it conferred by the School of Arts and Sciences. And Harvard at that time was in a strong decentralization process where each school was becoming its own entity. So he got funding to create the Graduate School of Education, and he wanted to have this practitioner degree, so he created an Education Doctorate. It was meant to support men who would get into these administrative roles. And so it was the right intent, but what ended up happening was he didn't know what that looked like. So he basically took the PhD and reduced the number of credits, I think originally it had a language requirement, but he reduced the language requirement, reduced the number of research courses they taught, and then let them focus on practical issues in their dissertations. But he also invited the PhD faculty from the School of Arts and Sciences to teach in it, right? So nobody knew what was supposed to be different. They just did what they knew how to do and gave it a different name. And so over time, that model got adopted at schools of education around the country, and it got adopted in two ways. In one way, it was adopted as a practitioner degree, and in other ways, it was adopted as a means to become independent from the School of Arts and Sciences. So universities around the country saw it as a different focus, and in no way was it ever really distinguished in terms of curriculum or the requirements or the assessments that were done from what was done in a PhD. And over time, multiple studies came out. I call it an academic debate of what is the difference? Do we need them both? Can we get rid of one? At one point, Art Levine suggested that we just scrap a doctorate in education altogether and look for something that might be like the equivalent of an MBA in education. And so when I was in my grad program, that's when the Carnegie Foundation kind of had decided that we really needed, based on some work they were doing, we really needed to come up with what's the difference between these two. And so my project that I run now, the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate, has been trying for 15 years to make that distinction. Now, I believe we have in many ways made that distinction, but the word hasn't gotten out everywhere, right? And people have different understandings of which one's better. Over that time of confusion, the EdD became known as the PhD light. So there are a lot of traditionalists who have PhDs will say, don't get an EdD because it's not good enough. And then you'll see a lot of people who have EdDs who went to programs where the EdD was the research doctorate in their school of education. And so they are trained to do research the same way PhDs are. So there has not really been one clear understanding. And so we've tried to kind of parse that out and make a claim that the EdD is meant to prepare people who want to transform practice. So it is a professional practice doctorate in the same way that an MD is a professional practice doctorate and is different from, say, a PhD in biochemistry.
Sure.
And it is meant to prepare people who are going to use research and inquiry and existing knowledge and research skills to be able to change practice on the ground in their own settings. So it's just as strong of a degree, it just has a different purpose. And so if you look at like what a PhD does every day as a faculty member, and you'll know this, Ramon, like we go to committee meetings, we teach students, we have to know how to do assessments, we have to know how to read dissertations, we have to know how to research and write articles and get into peer-reviewed journals and things like that. That's not what a practitioner does, right? But a practitioner deals with a lot of data every day as they think about the problems that we face in education in this country. So we need to teach them differently so that stats course isn't just something they survived in their doctorate. It's actually something they know how to use and do in practice to make their practice better.
No, that's interesting, right? Because I have my EdD in educational leadership, and so being in that space, all my professors had PhDs. So the honest experience that I got was it was definitely a PhD experience. with all the in terms of how we were taught, trained, etc. So
Yeah.
I find that there even just in EDD programs, depending on who your faculty are, can really impact to your experience.
Right. And I think some of that comes from, as PhDs, we're not trained to teach anything other than what we experienced, right? So PhDs don't get training in teaching, and they also don't understand that oftentimes as a PhD, you're not going to go into an institution where you're teaching other PhDs, because there are fewer PhDs in the world than there are professional practice doctorates. So chances are in education, you're going to be teaching EDDs. And so they may not have that understanding of the distinction for practitioners versus researchers. And so there's a lot of institutions that still treat it as a PhD or a research degree like yours did. And we're trying to just make that distinction so that what you saw before was a lot of classrooms that had K-12 practitioners in classrooms with students who wanted to be university faculty. And the course, though the topic may have been relevant to both of them, really needs to have different distinct ways that it's taught so that one knows what to do with that information. Well, actually, that both know what to do with that information in their practice, right? So we practice education as teachers, they practice education on the ground, running schools, running universities, things like that.
No, that's great. So I'm glad because again, I just see these debates pop up, and I'm just like, all right, I'm always for the mindset that it's how you leverage your degree as well. So like, you have a PhD, but very much want to be practitioner oriented, and go into those spaces where you have EDD, you might want to do research. So I think there's opportunities with both
And,
degrees.
and there's no reason to say that one can't be the other, right?
Yeah.
We just want to make sure that the way people are trained. So you wouldn't want someone with a PhD in biochemistry sticking you with a needle, right? Because they weren't trained to be practitioners in a room with a patient. But that doesn't mean that medical doctors don't do research, right? When there's outbreaks in their community, they gather data, they look at data to try and understand what's happening. So research isn't owned by one or the other. It's just the way that it's done and to what end does it serve. And so we want to ensure that the programs, both the PhD and the EDD, although we focus solely on the EDD, is geared towards people who want to stay in practice but know how to take all of that existing knowledge and use it in ways that will be beneficial to changing education.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because my first faculty job was teaching in educational leadership, and I'm always like, look, you all have to know how to use research methods because you're going to get there're going to be things that come across your desk, interventions for your children in your schools, and if you don't understand, are these actually valid and reliable for the population that I serve, then you might be throwing away $10,000-$20,000 on an intervention that would
Right.
never work for your population. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. And so, as you're going through your doctoral program, you're writing your dissertation, did you kind of breeze through that process or did you experience any roadblocks to finishing? Because I know a lot of students get to the dissertation and they're like, oh, wait a minute, I got to figure this thing out. And sometimes it takes them a while to get through.
I think, doing a dissertation, it seems insurmountable when you're on that side of it. But once you've done it, you can look back and go, gosh, maybe that wasn't that hard. But I don't think we're actually prepared in our programs for what's going to come at us at a dissertation, right? And it also depends on what your personal life has going on. So if you are a practitioner and you're still working, trying to fit a dissertation in can be overwhelming, and you may end up like putting it aside, and next, years are going by.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to have a graduate assistantship where I was a full-time student, although I also had a part-time job that I was working on. So I don't think I've ever not had a job. But I was able to take the time and focus on it. But I also had the circumstances where my new advisor that I'd gotten wasn't actually in my department. And so they said to me, he can't be your advisor. He could be a co-advisor. So I got the chair of the department to be my second co-advisor. And he said to me, I'm retiring in a year, so this better be done by December. And at that point, it was like January 2nd or something. And I said, oh, God, okay, I got to do this thing.
Yeah.
So I think, I set out a timeline, and I'm a big fan of like marking the end and working your way back with little steps of what could get you through it. And not just the big chunks of, oh, I need to write chapter 4. Chapter 4 needs to be broken down into little baby steps. Otherwise, it's going to be this thing hanging out there. I need to write chapter 4. I need to write chapter 4. Well, if you can do something small towards that every day, then you're working towards it, right? So I mapped out a process and I gave myself goals every single day of what I was going to do. And that was early on, I was going to read 2 or 3 articles and summarize them for my literature review. And then later on, when I was transcribing my interviews, I was going to transcribe 3 interviews a day. And if it was midnight and I still had one more to go, I'm like, you set this goal, you've got to do it.
Yeah.
So I held myself to that. But I was fortunate, like I said, I had a full-time assistantship. I didn't have kids or a husband at that point, and so it was a little bit easier. I know life gets in the way, and I have colleagues who have gotten their dissertations while raising small children, and it was the same kind of thing. They worked it out with their families. They said, I'll do the dinner time routine, but by 8 o'clock, I need to be at my computer, and I'm working from 8 to 11 or 8 to midnight every night, and that's when it was, and that's when it was going to get done. And, one of the things we've seen with the EDD and the changes to the EDD, where programs are being condensed into 3-year programs for practitioners, that timeline helps people understand, okay, I'm only giving up 3 years of my life to do this.
Yeah.
PhD programs or traditional research programs don't have that timeline. It's sort of, you take these classes, when the classes are done, you're off on your own. And without some kind of guidance, that 1 year that I took could have taken me like 7 years. But I scheduled times to meet with my practitioner. I kept a notebook that sort of looked like this. I'm sure there's more advanced ways to do it now, but I wrote everything from my research notes in there to every time I met with an advisor, what they said. At the end of the day, when I was done working, I wrote down my final thoughts so that when I got up the next morning, I wasn't starting over.
Great. I love that.
But if you leave too much time in between when you touch it, you think it's in your head, but inevitably you'll sit down and go, what the heck was I thinking, right? So it's something you've got to commit to in the same way you might commit to, saving money to buy a new car or wanting to lose a few pounds or something. You've got to touch it every day, and you've got to set out that timeline and those goals.
I'm glad you said that, because every week when I, do live streams about different aspects of the dissertation, I talk a lot about this idea of some folks can do it. So it's not that you can't do it, but the binge writing thing, when you write, let's say on Tuesday, and then you come back next Tuesday, like you said, you're just going to come back to it like, what the heck was I writing? And then you go back to edit what you previously wrote. And then now an hour and a half has gone by and you have written nothing next time. So
Yep.
I agree with you.
It's me all the time now. Even now writing, I do that. And I'm like, oh no, you're not editing this. Just keep writing. And there's a great article, actually. It's called the First Shitty Draft. We share it with our students in our doctoral program because inevitably you're going to write crap, but just get it out of you and get it on the page, because editing is so much easier than writing. And I have a colleague at Duquesne University who says the first 15 pages of anything he writes is just him clearing his throat. And that seems like a lot of work. You're like, oh my God, I just wrote all that and I'm not going to use it. You're going to use it. You're just not, you're not writing perfect the first time you put something down. So if you can just get it all out of you and get it down and then go back and edit, editing is so much easier and your thoughts come together better editing, but you got to get the original stuff out of you first.
I hope everybody's taking notes on this, because that is exactly the case. And I always say that you can't edit anything in your head. So if it's not on paper, we can do nothing with it. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that sees it like this, because I think a lot of students are trying to figure out, how do I write? How do I do this? And they have all this, a lot of people have anxiety about writing, so they choose not to write. Or they go back and just edit everything and they never write anything new. So I'm glad that you had a process to move through that.
There's a book, and I don't remember the name of it. It's The Artist something. It's for people who are artists. And one of the ideas that helps you sort of when you have writer's block, it's 3 pages. And somebody gave me that book a long time ago, and I've used it from everything from writing to just sort of self-counseling to figuring things out. It's that you're going to sit down every day and you're going to write 3 pages by hand or type it. And you could write the same word for 3 pages, but you're writing, right? Something is getting down on paper. And so you can narrow that down to a page and a half, but get something on paper every single day, even if it's crappy, because you've got to get started somewhere.
That is great. I hope people, again, taking notes on this. And if you're going through the doctoral program, you need to be just applying this consistent writing to your coursework as well as your dissertation, because I think that really helps you move forward. And as you're wrapping up your dissertation, did you know exactly what you wanted to do as you finished, or what did that process look like you for transitioning as you left the program?
I wasn't sure. The option to be faculty was out there, but I'd always been a practitioner beforehand, and I thought I wanted some kind of sweet in between where
Yeah.
I could do a little bit of both. Turns out that's what I do, but it might be a little too much of both, but that's what I do now. I got a postdoc because I wanted to try the faculty route, and I hadn't published enough in my program. And so the postdoc was going to give me an opportunity to sit and work with my dissertation and
Yeah.
get some publications out of it. And then I also did some grant work and things like that to kind of give me that opportunity. And a postdoc is kind of like a sort of an internship. Internship's not the right word, apprenticeship, because
Yeah.
then you're working around other faculty and they're helping you, right? They're talking to you about what it means to be a faculty member. You sort of get ease into understanding what that means. Whereas I think if you go right in as junior faculty, that can be completely overwhelming in terms of everything that gets thrown at you in the beginning. But I also wanted to stay in practice, so I consider myself a practitioner first by being the executive director of CPED. I spend much of my day working with people around the country, helping them think through what it means to have an EdD program that is a practitioner degree. I was just on the phone this morning with the University of Maryland talking about what do we mean about a dissertation in practice is what we call it for an EdD. What does that look like? How does it work? And so I do a lot of discussions like that. I do a lot of writing around that. And then I do everything from like working with our budget to planning meetings with, our big annual meeting and things like that. So I have a really nice job that straddles both worlds. And I love that I get to teach students. I love that I get to read their dissertations. I think now my next job may be an editor because I've done so much of it.
Yeah.
But it's great to see other people's ideas get fleshed out on paper and help them think that through. Particularly when you're working with practitioners who are doing dissertations on their own practice, they're much too close to it at times. And so you're able to be that outside view and say, you're too close, step back a little bit and see what's going on here. And then for them to be able to see how research works in practice is really rewarding. But no, I didn't go into my PhD thinking that, in fact, in my program, International Ed Policy, we were a cohort of 20, I think. I'm the only one that ended up in education as faculty.
Okay.
The majority went into practice doing some form of development work.
That makes sense given the program. And
Yeah.
so, can you talk a bit about how the role of a professor of practice? Because I know some people are always familiar with like tenure track.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the professor of practice as a position? Because I think some people may be interested in that route as well.
Sure. So professor of practice is a job that means that you are, and it's different at every institution,
Sure.
but it's a job that means that you're coming out of practice, or in my case, still working in practice, but you're come out of practice and you have something to share with other people. So I'm in education, and that you have something else to share with the students, but you're not necessarily focused on hard and fast research agenda, right? You're more interested in working with students and teaching and maybe running sort of the internship aspect of programs, advising students on dissertations, designing courses, helping to design programs. So you have a different set of criteria for promotion than, say, a tenure track faculty. It's a tenure track faculty member generally has about 6 years to work on their package for tenure. And then once they have tenure, they may have an annual contract, but they have tenure for life. Professor of practice, you come in, you have an annual contract that you do every year, and your workload is a little bit different. You may teach more classes. You're not expected to do as much research or the kind of research. So the research that I do is practical research. It focuses on things related to the Education Doctorate. My last grant that I got from the WT Grant Foundation in DC or in New York was looking at how practitioners use research evidence in practice as a result of having an EdD. So I was trying to understand, as EdD students, they've learned a lot, they've trained to write a dissertation in practice. Are they continuing to use research evidence and research practices after they've graduated out of their program? And so my research is much more practical. It gets published in more practical journals. It's work that I would use more to do trainings for other universities who are trying to do things, whereas a tenure track faculty member sort of hunkers down and focuses on what they want to research. They may be out in the field gathering that, but their ultimate goal is to publish in tier 1 journals and to present that work at national conferences or international conferences. And while they teach, their teaching load would be a little bit lighter, their advising load might be a little bit lighter. And oftentimes they're 8 months or 9 months a year, whereas professors of practice are 12 months a year. I happen to be 8 months because I also run the Carnegie Project, but the majority of them are 12-month faculty as well.
So let me
And
ask you this. So how do you balance? So how do you balance the faculty role and then, CPED, and like it seems like you've been able to like blend the two, but I'm curious as to how you manage, because I think a lot of students are figuring out they may have consultancy and faculty or something, kind of they're trying to balance both.
it really helps when the two line up together. And this is probably another reason why I switched my dissertation topic, because I was getting very involved in CPED.
Yeah.
And once my dissertation switched over to that, my head was in one space, right? It was always something EDD related. And so I teach in the EDD program here. I help design the program. I'm particularly one of the lead designers on our methods courses, which focus on improvement science. So I've done a lot of work in improvement science on my own. I've written a book about it, and then I've written that book in a practitioner from a practitioner lens, and so that book is used in classes. It's used by faculty. So it all sort of comes together. So when I'm thinking about I want to write a companion book to go with that book that I wrote, and a lot of that will come from my teaching in my class. Like, what kinds of tools am I using in my class? The companion book would be a set of tools. So what am I using in my class that would support faculty or students who are learning and teaching improvement science? So it all kind of comes together. If you ask me to show you my to-do list and how that works, or my calendar, I'm not entirely sure I know how that works. I tell my child that I have 2 part-time jobs, but really 2 full-time jobs. And then they remind me that they are also a job of mine, so that I have 3 full-time jobs. I do work a lot, and I can work pretty much anywhere. So, on airplanes, coffee shops, wherever. So my computer is always with me. But I think, it's passion. It has to do with passion, right? I'm not punching a time card and doing something that I hate. I am energized when I get phone calls, like from a student yesterday who we've been trying to get his dissertation done. He's one of those that sort of drifted off after the courses were done. Yeah. And I reeled him back in, and he finally got his final draft sent off to his committee. He's graduating in May, so we've got to get it defended next week and done. And he's calling me at 10 o'clock at night and said, "Can you read this right now?" And I'm like, "Yes, because I committed to you that we would have this thing to your committee." So it's that kind of passion, I think, that drives me. Not to mention, there are days I'm exhausted, but I get excited about the work that I do. I get excited about the students on the professor side. I get excited about working with faculty around the country. And just you saying, that debate, the EDD PhD debate, is still out there. I'm like, well, I've been doing this for 15 years. I got another 15 to go because this thing has not been settled. So it's that kind of passion that gets you moving in the morning. So make sure whatever it is that you study or do your dissertation on, this goes back to why I said pick something that you're interested in, because that topic sticks with you for a while. Yeah. And if you're going to put all that work in it, it might as well be something that you are very passionate about and that you want to use going forward, right? It's not just a credential, PhD, EDD, whatever kind of doctorate it is. It's not just a credential. It's a changing of who you are and what you know and how you know how to be. So invest in it and, give it the time that it needs and say, this is where I'm headed. And then when you're done, you get the luxury of putting doctor on every credit card you own and every hotel reservation you make, and everyone calls you doctor. And it reminds you of how hard you worked and that you deserve it. So
that's perfect. And so as we wrap up, I would love for you to just give any words of advice for doctoral students who are going through the dissertation process based on what you're seeing now, being someone who helps usher students through. So what are some things that you're seeing work for your students that others you think can implement and benefit from?
I would say definitely any kind of mapping out of the process, right down to baby steps, because if you complete something once a day, then you feel like you've done something towards the dissertation. But also recognize that you're being too hard on yourself no matter what you say, and to make sure you do take breaks for fresh air, to go out with friends whenever you can, to spend time with your families, because if it consumes you, you're just going to hate it. And sometimes walking away will give you all the new perspective that you were trying to do. And the last piece of advice I'll give, because one of my doctoral professors gave this to me, whenever you're spinning and you don't understand something, it means you need to go back to the literature. You don't have enough information. And so when it's not coming together, either in the beginning or when you're working on the findings piece of your dissertation and you're struggling, just go back and read something, and that will get your juices flowing. You may find what you were looking for, the connection you needed to make. But know that it's a process and it's not going to be a one and done sit thing. It is going to be a process of at least a year. I think a
Yeah.
year is probably a quick way to do it.
Yeah, that's what we specialize in, because like a lot of folks are just in these programs and then they're just spinning around. But I do agree with you with just kind of really being mindful of taking time away. And it seems so kind of counterintuitive to getting through the process, but I call it in my book, 14 Secrets for Done Dissertation, I call it dissertation intoxication. We become so consumed with it, it kind of just puts you in a stupor a little bit. And so it's like,
Yep.
you got to just get out of that. And that's when you have hopefully you have an accountability group of some sort to kind of pull you out for a minute to do something else. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
It's great to find writing groups or other groups of students. If you're in a cohort model, you have that cohort support, because they can pull you through when you're down. They can tell you when you need a break. They can support you in any way that you need. So definitely look for a group of people.
That's perfect. Dr. Perry, as we wrap up, where can folks learn more about what you do, your work, your research? Where would you like folks to go to kind of keep up with what you got going on?
Well, if you Google me, Jill A. Perry, you should find me at the University of Pittsburgh. So you can find me at pitt.edu, Jill Perry, or you can also look up the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate, and our website is CPED Initiative, all one word, .org. And you can learn more about the EdD and the PhD distinction there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. I'm going to put you behind the scenes for a second just to wrap up, and then we'll chat in a few. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Done Dissertation Office Hours. I hope you all got a lot of value from that episode, just learning more about the EdD versus PhD debate, learning about some nuggets about how do you get through the process of your dissertation, and then also how do you balance, work, dissertation, and everything else, and how do you mesh what you do in your research. Again, you need to be passionate about it, as Dr. Perry mentioned. Again, I want to say thank you so much for all for tuning in. I'm Dr. Ramon Goings, founder of Done Dissertation, where we demystify the dissertation process so that doctoral students can write and defend a dissertation in 1 year or less. If you're a doctoral student going through the dissertation process and you need support to get through, what I want you to do is to grab our 10 strategies to complete your dissertation checklist. If you text #free to 301-701-2466, you can grab your checklist, and let's make sure that you get your dissertation done this year. And as always, if you want to learn more about how to work with us, you can visit www.thedonedissertation.com. I look forward to seeing you all next week on another episode of Done Dissertation Office Hours.